Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Season Starters. Sorceress, I choose you! I want to be a sorceress, not a sorcerer. Because the sorcerer looks like a man in drag. Every element under my command, lightning, ice, and fire. To harness them, to burn the demons, and encase them in ice. These elemental attacks are so really friggin' nice. Bow, bow, bow. Okay, guys and gals, let's get serious. So the Sorceress. Why should we play the Sorceress over any other character in Diablo 4 for Season 1 start? Well, let's go over the reasons, shall we? I mean, first, she looks really cool. Not the Sorcerer, just the Sorceress. Sorcerer looks like a man in drag, thus the funny line in the song. They really need to fix that, by the way. The Sorceress, on the other hand, looks really nice, and you even get some under boobage there, which definitely sells the, yes. The Sorceress, however, is definitely a caster type character. There are tons of different caster abilities that you can utilize on this particular character. Obviously, from the song, you can even surmise that there is obviously lightning, fire, and ice. Those are the three elements that she has access to. The Sorceress, honestly, has a lot of really fun builds. Not Inferno or Incinerate, no, not that one. But but Frozen Orb, Ice Shards, Chain Lightning, Charged Bolts, those are all pretty decent. I haven't really quite figured out a good Fireball build, and Incinerate just doesn't really seem good no matter what. There's also a pretty sweet Arc Lash build, and quite honestly, Firebolt is actually pretty sweet as well as a early starter ability. Mainly because it has the ability to pierce when you're hitting a burning enemy, which is pretty darn cool. And when it pierces, it hits multiple targets, and it does lots of burning damage to everything that it pierces, which is actually pretty sweet. Well, I was actually kind of surprised about that one. Both Arc Lash and Firebolt have kind of surprised me as basic skills. Now, the character does have a lot of defensive cooldowns. You have things like Flame Shield, which will protect you from death at one time. There's Teleport, which is basically a movement ability, but also kind of a defensive ability too, because you can get some damage reduction. We also have Glass Cannon, which will just make you dish out lots more damage, but also take lots more damage in return. And Ice Armor, which gives you a pretty nice defensive mechanic as well. In fact, quite honestly, there's really a lot of good defensive mechanics, including the Frost Nova ability, which has a very nice vulnerable added onto it, which can make enemies vulnerable for up to 6 seconds, which is pretty darn cool. Frost Nova actually squeezes its way into a lot of builds. On top of this, there's also a whole conjuration tree, which allows you to summon little pets. They're not like pets, they're more like elemental like creations. And we have the Hydras, the Ice Blades, and the Lightning Spear. All three of those are some interesting conjuration options. Now, in general, when it comes to this particular character, I don't. Why am I not using Conjuration Mastery? Put some points in there. I got a bunch of points missing for some reason. So this particular character also has access to a lot of other abilities like Blizzard, Meteor, Firewall, and Ball Lightning, and all of these can actually be made around as well. You can build whole characters around like pretty much all of these skills. As far as starter characters go, Arc Lash is a pretty powerful starter character. In fact, I even have this in my guide already, but if you haven't checked it out, it's pretty cool. Chain Lightning is a pretty good starter ability. Firewall is a pretty good starter ability. And quite honestly, it's just a lot of fun to mess around with a lot of these attacks. Like, Firewall is pretty cool, but it also has an ability that allows you to regenerate mana for every single Firewall you have up. So there's like a ton of different ways that you can build your character. The ultimates on the Sorceress are also all pretty interesting as well. Inferno is used a lot because it draws enemies in, which can be very useful if you're trying to set up, attacks where you want to hit all the targets at one time. Deep Freeze can be extremely useful because it works very well as a defensive cooldown, freezing everything around you in a circle, which is kind of cool. And kind of makes you pretty, hard to kill and as well because you're immune for 4 seconds. And, it basically makes it so that you can save your life. It's a very decent defensive cooldown. Unstable currents is really weird in that basically every single time you attack, it basically just like pulls a random shock skill from your core conjuration or mastery shock skills, and it just casts that instead. So like you just constantly start spewing lightning attacks all over the place. Now, when you take a look at the key masteries, there's definitely a lot of different choices. There's 2 different freezing choices. There's 2 different lightning choices. There's 2 different fire choices, and they really kind of are distinct from each other. For example, one of them focuses on crackling energy for the lightning, and the other one focuses on damage reduction from close, so that you can get in there and you can actually fight things as a close range sorceress, which is pretty amazing. One of the fire abilities gives you like amazing amount of damage increases depending on how many burning effects you have on the enemy at any given time, and another one like Esu's Ferocity gives you a damage bonus against monsters above 50% life, and killing an enemy with a critical strike grants bonuses against all the enemies for 3 seconds. On the freezing side, you get after freeze expires, the enemies explode for 25% of the damage you dealt to them while frozen. And then you also have Avalanche, with your frost skills have a 10% chance to cast the next ice shards, frozen orb, or blizzard, consume no mana, which is a whole other way that you can make the character even more interesting. Now, if all of these skills doesn't impress upon you a lot of fun in how you can build your character, well, the Sorceress has one more mechanic, which makes things even more interesting, and this is the enchantment effect. The Sorceress gets 2 enchantment slots, and these enchantment slots can be used for whatever you want. And you can make it so that your teleport turns into an evasion skill. You can make it so that every time you stun an enemy, charge bolts shoot out. You can make it so that every time you hit an enemy with a skill, it applies burning damage to them. You can make it so that whenever you cast a non-basic skill, you have a 24% chance to launch a frozen orb at a nearby enemy. And like there is a ton of various ways that you can make your character into like a friggin' tanky beast or a damaging god, or like make it so that you can regenerate mana. Like chain lightning forms automatically after spending 83 mana, so you get like free chain lightnings for spending mana. This one right here with Meteor gives you a 10% chance for a meteor just to fall on enemies when lucky hit happens. Firewall is pretty cool too. It's one of my favorite ones, which is basically it just spawns 2 firewalls in an X pattern, by the way, so that it literally goes underneath the monster in an X and covers the biggest piece of area that it possibly can. It's actually really freaking awesome because you just get like free firewalls constantly all the time. In general, there are tons of ways that you can customize your character with the enchantment slots, and there are some interactions that I think even maybe Blizzard didn't quite think of when they first started. Like, for instance, if you use Firebolt as an enchantment, it burns all the enemies. Well, then you can utilize other passives, like, for instance, the fire passives, because now the monsters are burning, and you can get things like Devouring Blaze, deal 10% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies, and if they are also immobilized, its bonus increased by 25%. So you can actually obtain extra bonuses, simply by adding in something as simple as an enchantment, which causes monsters to burn. Even if you're a frost sorceress or a lightning sorceress, you can still get benefits like this. And honestly, it's actually really cool, in my opinion, how the sorceress enchantment slots work, because you can really make some crazy builds. Let me give you a for instance. So my character right now is utilizing basically the enchantment, which allows me to stun everything when I teleport. So every time I teleport with my teleport ability, it draws everything in because I'm utilizing the Raiment of the Infinite. It stuns them, and when it stuns them, since I'm utilizing the Charge Bolts enchantment, I have a 5% chance to increase. 25%. Not that one. Not that one. A 48% chance is what it should be. 48% chance to release 3 charge bolts from any monster that is stunned. So, when I teleport into a pack of monsters, what ends up happening is something like this. Everything gets stunned and the charge bolts just come out, right? Then I can combine it with something else, like for instance Unstable Currents, which makes it even better. And everything pretty much dies all at the same time when I teleport into the group of monsters. Because everything gets teleported in, everything gets stunned, lightning shoots out, Unstable Currents fires off, and all sorts of beautiful things start to happen. Every time you build your character, you're going to come across different things like this, which are going to change the way that your character works, like overall. And it's going to make it very interesting to try and figure out exactly how you're going to make your skills work. Like, what abilities are you going to use? Now, the one thing I will recommend is that, like, my Charge Bolt build, don't build that as a starter character. I need 2 items to actually make this work. One is the Staff of the Lama Sem, which allows the Charge Bolts to pierce, and another is the aspect of the Static Cling, which allows the Charge Bolts to last for 300% longer and dish out 34.5% chance to be attracted to enemies. So without those 2 aspects, I'm probably not going to get anywhere near as much damage as I would normally. And this character is far from refined, so there is that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to go over really quickly the endgame builds that you might choose for your sorceress in the new latter season. So, Blizzard is a very powerful endgame build and has been proven to absolutely demolish Uber Lilith. So, if you want to make a Blizzard sorceress, that is a whole thing. And there are tons of guides out there for you. But if you want to just wing it, which is usually what I do, it shouldn't be too ridiculously difficult. Ice Shards is a very popular one. A lot of sorceresses have been using the Ice Shards build. And Ice Shards has a very nice enchantment, which is one of the reasons why it's so powerful, which basically allows it to just simply automatically fire, conjure, and fly toward frozen enemies. So anytime you freeze an enemy, you have a chance of essentially getting free attacks, right? So constantly freezing enemies means more attacks, and more attacks means more chilling, and more chilling means more frozen, and basically it's a recursive cycle, and you can get tons and tons and tons and tons of attacks with Ice Shards. It's a very popular one so far, and I think, quite honestly, it's really powerful. Arclash is also extremely powerful. It is a basic build, which is kind of crazy. It has a lot of damage reduction and probably utilizes Veer's Mastery, I would assume, because you're going to be a close range sorceress at that point. Charge Bolts, which is the one that I'm doing, that is my endgame build, and there's probably actual build guides out there for it, but I have not peeked at a single one. I've just been having fun trying to figure it out on my own. On top of that, there's also a very nice build revolving around Firewall if you want to set it up. It's not exactly, I think, the absolute best right now. There's definitely, I think, Arclash, Blizzard, and Ice Shards are kind of ahead of it at this particular point. But it's definitely workable, and if you want to play around with Firewall, it certainly does do its job. And maybe you just want to come up with your own build and just play around with stuff and just have fun. I mean, it's certainly possible that you might come up with a new build that the big wigs in the websites haven't thought of. In fact, it feels like I've come up with several builds so far that nobody's really thought of, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. Now, the sorceress does have a failing, and I think we need to talk about that really quickly. So right now, the resistances of the game are based upon your armor value, and that basically half of it is your armor value. And on top of that, they don't really calculate properly. And every class kind of has a main stat. Sorceress is intelligence. Well, intelligence scales resistance, which is how they're supposed to get their resistances, their defensiveness. They're supposed to have very high resistances. But nobody has really high resistances right now, including the sorceress and the necromancer, which have intelligence as their main stat, which means that the sorceress ends up being a little squishy compared to some of the other classes. Another big downside of the sorceress is there's not really a lot of good ways to build fortify. A lot of characters have some pretty reliably ways to build fortify. Barbarians can build reliable fortify. Druids can build reliable fortify. Necromancers can build reliable fortify. But sorceresses, not as much. It's very difficult for sorceresses to build fortify. So compounding on the issues of the sorceress is already not exactly the most tanky beast in all the universe. We also have the fact that, well, she also doesn't have one of the more tanky features within the game, which is fortification. What she does have in spades, though, is crowd control. Whether it is stuns in the form of lightning attacks, whether it is chills and freezes in the form of ice attacks, or just simply burning the monster into oblivion, which I believe there's a couple various things that go on with the fire attacks, too, like... I remember, I think that some of these have stuns attached to them. I can't remember. But in general, when it comes to the ice and the lightning trees, between all the freezes and stuns that go on between those two trees, they tend to be very crowd control related. And this basically means that you end up with a character that can pretty much just lock down most targets. And if they can't lock down the targets, then it probably just means their cooldowns are down at that particular moment. Because it's very rare that you'll see a sorceress without some way to lock down most monsters around them, like Deep Freeze, which basically allows you to lock down everything except for bosses. And speaking of bosses or unstoppable monsters in general, this is also an issue for the sorceress. So when you attack a monster like the Butcher is always unstoppable, and so the crowd controls don't work on him. In fact, bosses also doesn't work on bosses, and this is a problem because the sorceress does rely on those crowd controls a lot to save her life in dangerous situations. And so if you are a character that relies on crowd controls heavily, you will also find yourself heavily at a disadvantage whenever those crowd controls do not work. A lot of sorceresses I've been seeing lately have been taking multiple defensive cooldowns, which is pretty crazy because you end up with like teleport, freaking like ice armor, flame shield, and frost nova all at the same time, and then you put like a +3 defensive skills amulet on, and it gives you a +3 to all of them. A lot of people are taking these. Frost nova is one of the best ways to generate vulnerable on the sorceress. So this is something that we need to talk about as well, which is all classes have to have vulnerable to dish out good amount of damage. And basically you have to look at all of your vulnerable options on a class and kind of decide from there. There's a couple different options for vulnerable. One of them is the Greater Frozen Orb, which can make things vulnerable, which isn't really too amazing. We also have Frost Nova, which seems to be the best one because it has a 4-second vulnerability, which is increased to 6 seconds versus bosses, although it does have a cooldown of 21 seconds. Ice Blades can also make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds with a 40% chance, and they attack multiple times over 6 seconds, so it actually adds up to a pretty decent amount. And then I believe for the Paragon Glyph on this particular character, I'm trying to remember if the Exploit one actually includes... no. Okay, so some classes get a free vulnerable from Exploit Glyph, and the Sorceress is not one of these. So as you can see, instead of it saying that you can make one enemy vulnerable every 20 seconds, like in my Barbarian video, this one is dealing damage to vulnerable enemies increases the damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%. So you still get a bonus damage, but you don't get the other effect, which is basically free vulnerability once every 20 seconds on an enemy, which is kind of a downside. The vulnerable is something that the sorceress kind of struggles with a little bit. I think that is one thing that she's not the best at. Flickering Frostbolt makes frozen enemies vulnerable, and it's not really as amazing as it sounds, because making enemies frozen all the time is not always easy. And so, like, yeah, I mean, it comes in handy when a monster's frozen, but other than that, like, it's not really too crazy. I don't believe there's really a whole lot more in terms of vulnerability options for the Sorceress, and that's kind of sad. So a lot of the times when it comes to the Sorceress, you end up going with Frost Nova, maybe go with Ice Blades. I really doubt you're probably going to go with Frozen Orb unless it's your main ability, and unfortunately that's about it. I do think the Sorceress is a very fun character, and I have made several Sorceresses so far. I've made a Firewall Sorceress, I made a Charge Bolt Sorceress. I did try and make a Chain Lightning Sorceress back in beta, although I have not made one since the game launched. I have not done the Ice Shard Sorceress yet, but I have played with several Ice Shard Sorceress, and it looks freaking ridiculously OP. I'm not gonna lie. All in all, I think the Sorceress is one of those characters that is very fun to play, and I've actually been pleasantly surprised with how fun it is to play the Sorceress over the beta and also the launch of the game, and pretty much every other time I've managed to encounter her. Is she my personal favorite? I'm gonna say no, but definitely a solid choice for a starter character, especially since she has access to teleport, which gives her a little bit of a leg up in terms of mobility, although a lot of characters have a mobility option these days. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're just talking about the Sorceress and whether or not you should pick her for latter season start. And as always, keep watching.